The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird is a long-range, high-altitude, Mach 3 plus strategic reconnaissance aircraft, and first flew on December 22nd, 1964. Looking at it, that date just doesn't sound right. Like, the 1960s was full of plenty of aircraft that were really pushing the envelope in terms of technology at the time, but the Blackbird looks straight out of the future even now. Granted, there is a very good reason for that, as it is arguably one of the most advanced aircraft of its time, and to date there's really nothing exactly like this thing. It had a crew of 2, the pilot and the Reconnaissance Systems Officer, or RSO. They had a length of 107 feet 5 inches, a wingspan of 55 feet 7 inches, they sat at a height of 18 feet 6 inches, and their maximum takeoff weight was 172,000 pounds. The given maximum speed of the Blackbird in operation was 2,200 miles per hour at 80,000 feet, and they could fly as high as 85,000 feet. As you can imagine, developing an aircraft like this, especially in those days, was a tall order, but Lockheed proved up to the task, and wound up producing one of the most sophisticated aircraft of its day, setting multiple records for air-breathing operational manned aircraft throughout its career, and developing a strong cult following that remains to this day. The SR-71 was not the first spy plane that Lockheed had been responsible for. They had developed the U-2 spy plane, which is a story in and of itself, and it was originally meant for the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. But the U-2 aired on the relatively slow side, and it was known that it would be possible to make a reconnaissance aircraft that was far and away faster. So in late 1957, the CIA asked Lockheed to build what they called an undetectable spy plane. They wanted to be able to see what those dastardly communists were doing without the Soviets actually knowing we were watching them. The project was named Archangel, because the CIA are the grand masters of cool, top-secret project names, and was led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, who we mentioned last time as he was heavily involved in building the Starfighter. And it's easy to understand why he'd be involved, since he was the head of Lockheed's Skunk Works unit in Burbank, California. That's their super-de-duper top-secret element. Project Archangel began in the second quarter of 1958, and the goals highlighted were building an aircraft that would fly higher and faster than the U-2. 11 successive designs were drafted in the span of about 10 months, and the one designated A-10 was actually the frontrunner. No, not that one, but the shape of that particular design made it very vulnerable to radar detection, which was not what the CIA wanted. They were looking for stealth elements. So after a meeting with the CIA in March of 1959, the design was modified to have a 90% reduction in the radar cross-section. As a result of this, the CIA would approve $96 million, which is a little over $731 million in today's money, for a contract for Skunk Works to build a dozen of the spy planes that were named A-12 on February 11th, 1960. Just a few months later, a U-2 would be shot down by the Soviets, showing that the CIA was right in that they did need a better spy plane if they were going to avoid that sort of thing in the future. The A-12 would first fly at Groom Lake, otherwise known as Area 51 in Nevada. Yeah, everything about this screams Black Project. It's phenomenal, isn't it? On April 25th, 1962. 13 of those were built, and 2 variants were actually developed, including 3 YF-12 Interceptor prototypes, and 2 of the M21s, which were meant to carry drones in the 1960s. But I can't overstate how long ago this was all going on. Lockheed was really pushing the envelope here. Now, the A-12s were supposed to be powered by the Pratt & Whitney J-58 engines, but they ran into development issues, so they were initially equipped with the less powerful J-57s instead, and J-58s would become retrofitted as they became available, and did become the standard for all subsequent related aircraft, including the eventual SR-71. The A-12 would actually enter service, flying missions over Vietnam and North Korea, but they would be retired by 1968, and the cancellation had been announced December 28, 1966, due to the fact that these aircraft, while revolutionary, were insanely expensive. The CIA was running into some budgetary issues, so they just couldn't fund them anymore. but everyone was expecting a forthcoming plane, an evolution of the A-12, that would be known as the SR-71. And the Blackbird first took to the skies on December 22, 1964. The location of the first flight was appropriately a top-secret one, U.S. Air Force's Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. During flight testing, the Blackbird pushed to a top speed of Mach 3.4. And that wasn't entirely surprising. The aircraft had been designed to sustain that kind of insane speed. And even the construction of this thing required some, unusual additions. Mostly titanium. Normally, the use of titanium was limited by the costs involved, as it was an expensive material, and it was generally only utilized in other aircraft for their smaller components that would be exposed to the highest temperatures. But on the 71, that wasn't possible because the whole thing was going to be exposed to ridiculously high temperatures by flying at that speed. As such, titanium was used for 85% of the Blackbird, with the rest being polymer composite materials. To control the tremendous cost that this would involve, Lockheed would utilize a titanium alloy which actually softened at lower temperatures. But this still required them to develop new fabrication methods entirely, and they would find that washing welded titanium would require distilled water, not regular tap water, as there was a bit of chlorine in that, and that was corrosive. They also couldn't use cadmium-plated tools, as those also caused corrosion. Even just flying and controlling the Blackbirds had to be a unique practice due to the tremendous speeds. Major sections of the skin of the inboard wings were actually corrugated, not smooth. And initially, aerodynamicists hated that idea because at face value it doesn't really make a lot of sense. If it's corrugated, wouldn't that make it harder for the air to flow over it and slow the aircraft down by producing more drag? And technically, yes, if it remained corrugated. But it didn't. See, the heat expected was so high that it would cause a smooth skin to split and curl, which would be bad. But corrugated skin could expand vertically and horizontally, as well as allowing for increased longitudinal strength. It would effectively mold with the aircraft as the heat caused it to naturally warp. The fuselage panels were also manufactured to fit very loosely with the aircraft on the ground. Proper alignment would be achieved, again, when the airframe heated up and expanded. It would expand by a few inches, and it was the source of much frustration with ground crews, as, because it didn't fit solidly while on the ground and cold, prior to takeoff, the aircraft would actually straight up leak fuel. They didn't have a fuel sealing system either, because that wouldn't be able to handle the expansion at extreme temperatures. So fuel would spill all over the ground whenever they got taken out, and the ground crews would have to clean it up. But everything about this thing had to deal with the heat. The outer windscreen was made of quartz, and was fused ultrasonically to the titanium frame. The temperature of this windscreen on the exterior reached 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 316 degrees Celsius during a mission, and cooling had to be carried out by cycling fuel behind the titanium surfaces. Oh, yeah, how did we even get enough titanium to build this thing? Well, fun fact, it was from the USSR. Yes, really. How did we convince them to give it to us? By lying, of course. We worked through several third world countries as well as bogus operations, tricking the USSR into selling some titanium to these definitely not run by the USA companies, and then those companies would send it back to us, so we could build the plane to spy on the USSR. It's hilarious, actually. But how did they even get them to go that fast? Well, that was complicated too, as you might imagine. For one thing, their air inlets were very unique. The shape involved here basically caused the air entering it to slow down to subsonic speed as it entered the engine. At the front of each inlet, there was a pointed, movable cone that was called a spike, and it was locked in its full forward position on the ground and during subsonic flight. But as soon as the Blackbird went past Mach 1.6, an internal jack screw moved the spike up to 26 inches inwards, and it was directed by an analog air inlet computer that did take into account pretty much every element of the aircraft's current operation: pitch, roll, yaw, etc. Moving that spike drew the shockwave riding on it closer to the inlet until it touched just slightly inside the cowling lip. That position reflected the spike shockwave repeatedly between the spike center body and the inlet inner cowl sides, and minimized airflow spillage. The air slowed with a final plane shockwave at entry to the subsonic diffuser. If that sounds ridiculous, it's because it kind of is, but it's also genius and very technical. And given the sheer altitude these things would be flying at, the crews could not wear a typical pilot suit. They were pressure suits that were, frankly, a lot closer to space suits than anything else. And the forces these planes were subjected to are no joke. They would literally fly themselves apart on most missions. The Air Force could only handle putting them in the air about once a week, because exceedingly often, they would return with rivets missing, or delaminated panels, or other broken pieces like the inlets that required repair or replacement. There were some cases of planes not being ready to fly again for a month. And mind you, this wasn't because they were, getting shot at on the regular, because they generally could avoid getting shot at. And even if they did, the typical procedure was just to speed up. But when they got back on the ground, just the act of flying at the speeds was hard on them. So they needed constant attention, and that did drive up operational costs. The aircrafts would fly over Vietnam, and during that time, the North Vietnamese would fire at least 800 missiles at them. None of them ever hit. The Blackbirds would also be used to spy on the USSR from the west, and that annoyed Sweden as they were trying to stay neutral in this whole situation. They actually launched Saab 37 Viggens to intercept them, but the Viggens was not really in a position to catch a 71. See, the Viggens could only hit Mach 2.1 and had a service ceiling of only 18 kilometers, so they were both slower and below the Blackbirds. The Swedish did manage to get locks on them on occasion, but that was only when approaching the Blackbirds from the front. And the problem is if they ever fired, well, they were kind of relying on the Blackbird not, just changing direction. During that time, there was also an incident that was kept secret for years. On June 29, 1987, one of the Blackbirds was on a mission around the Baltic Sea to spy on Soviet postings, but then they suffered a significant engine failure. And by that I mean the engine exploded. They were 20 kilometers in the sky when this happened, and they quickly lost altitude and turned 180 degrees to the left, and wind up flying over Gotland to search for the Swedish coast. This act, of course, violated Swedish airspace, and two unarmed Viggens that were on an exercise were ordered to investigate. They discovered the Blackbird, but it was obviously in distress, and the Swedish made the decision to escort the plane out to the Baltic Sea. A second round of Viggens would actually replace the first pair and bring the Blackbird into Danish airspace. The whole thing was classified for over 30 years because multiple MiG-25s had the order to shoot down that Blackbird or force it to land, and were in the air right before the engine failed. One of those 25s did manage to get a missile lock on the Blackbird, but because she was under escort at the time, they opted not to fire. And much later, on November 28, 2018, the 4 Swedish pilots that were involved in that situation were given medals by the United States Air Force. Another fun fact about the Blackbirds is that they did have 3 different variants, though the main one was the SR-71A, and that flew pretty much every single mission. There was the B, of which there were only 2 ever made, which was designed specifically as a trainer. The major difference is that there's a place for the instructor. Those variants have a weird little bulbous thing jutting out the top of them. And then there was the SR-71C, which I absolutely have to talk about because I love this poor red-headed stepchild of the SR-71 family. The C was a hybrid trainer, but she was composed of the rear fuselage of the very first YF-12A and the forward fuselage from an SR-71 static test unit. The YF-12 had been wrecked in a 1966 landing accident, and apparently the C was never quite straight and had a yaw at supersonic speeds. It doesn't seem to be quite right. It was caused by a misaligned pilot tube that was reporting a 4-degree yaw that wasn't actually there. It was eventually corrected and she flew normally, though she was nicknamed, and children watching this is a very bad word, and if your parents are in the room, get their permission before going forward. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay, not really. 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. The pilots called her the Bastard. That's what they called her. It's so horrible. But she was preserved, actually. She's one of the ones at the Hill Aerospace Museum at Hill Air Force Base, Ogden, Utah. So, hey, that's nice. Interestingly, the retirement of the Blackbird is almost as complicated as they were in and of themselves, because there was a lot of pushback regarding whether or not to retire them at all. No one had ever built a plane with the capabilities as the Blackbird had, but technology does move forward, and they would wind up being retired in 1989, partially because of a view that the Air Force themselves pointed out that besides the fact that the Blackbirds were always literally the most violently expensive things in the universe to operate, but they'd kind of become redundant in their role. There were other reconnaissance methods that were now available, particularly spy satellites, but there were also other issues that were going into this. There was a lot of Pentagon politics in the background, and various officers in the military and other legislators felt that retiring the Blackbird wasn't actually a good idea at all. Despite spy satellites existing, the Blackbird still offered intelligence capabilities that none of the alternatives could actually provide in the 1990s. Part of the issue is that a lot of the people that had worked with the Blackbird initially would retire by the mid-80s, and the new generation of Air Force generals wanted to cut the budget and spend the funding on different priorities, such as the B-2 Spirit, which admittedly is an also amazing aircraft. And those newer generals pushed the viewpoint that the Blackbird had been completely replaced by other alternatives, when in reality that wasn't really quite right. It was more of a sales pitch to Congress, rather than actual truth. And it seems more that these generals were using the Blackbird as kind of a bargaining chip to ensure the survival of a lot of their other projects. And eventually the final squadron of SR-71s would be retired, finally shutting down operations in mid-1990, with many of the aircraft being sent to static display locations, to be fair, in various museums, and a few being kept in reserve storage. Which is deeply relevant because the SR-71 Blackbird was actually reactivated. Congress re-examined them in 1993 due to escalating situations in the Middle East and North Korea. It was found that the better-than successor of the SR-71 hadn't actually been developed, and Lockheed would bring 3 of the planes back into service. But the Air Force actually kind of resisted this. They hadn't budgeted for operating the Black Hawk, and again, they were very expensive to do, and UAV developers worried that their programs would suffer if money was shifted to support these things. Plus, Congress wasn't actually making it any easier, as part of the agreement was that they would do a yearly reaffirmation of the program, but that meant long-term planning for the Blackbirds was basically impossible. In 1996, the Air Force did claim that specific funding hadn't actually been authorized and pushed to ground the whole thing. Congress reauthorized the funds, but in October of 1997, then-President Bill Clinton attempted to use the line item veto to cancel that. In June of 1998, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the line item veto was actually unconstitutional, so he couldn't actually do that. But all this political nonsense left the Blackbird's status uncertain until September of 1998, and the planes were permanently retired that same year. NASA would wind up operating the last 2 airworthy Blackbirds until 1999, as they were incredibly useful for their own research, given they could fly almost literally at the edge of space. And for what it is worth, all the Blackbirds that didn't suffer cataclysmic accidents were moved to museums, except for 2 that were retained by NASA. Speculation still exists regarding the SR-71 successor, the daughter of the Blackbird, if you will. The SR-72 was reported to be being made at Lockheed's Skunk Works back on November 1st, 2013, and apparently it would fly twice as fast as the original Blackbird, at Mach 6, which would be really impressive, but there's 2 things to consider here. For one thing, officially, The Air Force is pursuing a Northrop Grumman RQ-180 UAV to assume the Blackbird's role. And even if Lockheed does come out with the SR-72, it is also gonna be a UAV. It's an unmanned vehicle, which, I mean, I understand why the military pushes for those, because they don't put pilots in harm's way, but I guess when you do that, you kinda lose some of the magic, you know? Part of the reason the Blackbirds are so glorious is not only the facts that they were way ahead of their time, that they're just absolutely gorgeous, that they're blindingly fast, they can fly ridiculously high, but they also took people with them to accomplish these things. But in the modern day, it is unlikely we'll ever see a Blackbird fly again. They'll remain on static display, which admittedly isn't the worst end for them. They can still be enjoyed by museum goers, and still be fondly loved by their fans. And perhaps one day, whether she's a drone or not, the daughter of the Blackbird will light up the sky once again, like a candle in the infinite darkness of space.
For the candles in the darkness, burning up the sorrow, there's no end to sadness, we should learn. For the broken-hearted people, diamonds now surround us, so out of our mind, leave the past behind. Binary, a centrifugal force pushing us far away. That's our eternity. Binary, we can't escape the force crushing us. Gravity is our eternity.
And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-132, Anzac A1 Arthur Roy, Tommy Rostini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Row of Videos, Lord Otto 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drone Stall, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Travis Dolinsky, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Arizona Hot Rail, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness and a World of Fun. Farewell.